pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. Up first will be Lowell Call. Lowell is from Harvey, North Dakota. He's been farming since 1975. In 1994, Lowell switched over to organic farming, and in 2013, Lowell began farming emmer wheat. And Lowell's family has a long history of both farming as well as working with ancient grains and emmer. He's been a proud champion of emmer wheat. After Lowell, we'll have Dr. Cleta Shetty present. And Dr. Shetty is a professor of plant science and the founding director of the Global Institute for Food Security and International Ag at NDSU. Dr. Shetty has a long history working in food and food security. He earned his PhD in microbiology and his master's in bacteriology from the University of Idaho in Moscow. He works internationally. He's an author of over 225 peer-reviewed journal articles, 14 review and concept papers, 40 book chapters, and he's been cited extensively in peer-reviewed journals worldwide. He's had the opportunity to travel in over to 50 countries. And I actually first had the chance to meet Dr. Shetty at a conference, planning for a conference in Bali around healthy food. So a long history in food and health. So we're pleased to have both speakers with us today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lowell. Lowell, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Just wanted to say it's a real opportunity to be able to talk about emmer. This has been a passion of mine for many years. Being a farmer, and particularly a wheat farmer, it is something that's in your blood, and what I found out, it is my heritage going back, clear back to the 1400s. North Dakota Common emmer, a biblical wheat from ND farmers' point of view. Wild emmer in Ur of the Chaldees in Turkey is known as Noah's wheat. Abraham and Lot ate this wheat. It has been found in the campfires and around the hills in Sodom and Gomorrah, En Gedi by the Dead Sea, and northern Negev in storage pits. It is estimated that 50 to 70% of the daily calorie intake was ground grain. Emmer in Italy is known as farro, and that name comes from Pharaoh's wheat of Egypt. Emmer has been found in Joseph's grain bin in the 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. The unleavened bread of Exodus was made from emmer. Wild emmer is growing around Mount Sinai, along with millstones that have been found. This is where the children of Israel wandered for 40 years. It grows wild in Israel and is mentioned 3 times by name in the Hebrew text in Exodus 9:32, Ezekiel 4:9, and Isaiah 28:25, where the field borders were growing in emmer. This is what Jesus ate when the Pharisees accused him of working on the Sabbath, and what Jesus used in the first communion bread. In 1906, Aaron Armisen found wild emmer growing in the upper Galilee area and did extensive research with very favorable results. Emmer grain fed 60 million people in Europe. The North Dakota Common emmer strain has been traced back to the Glidstall area where my great-great-grandfather and his family immigrated and arrived in Jewell Township in the Dakota Territory in 1885. He was listed as a farmer, and his age was 62, and it was with undesignated cargo. Age 60 was the cutoff age to immigrants, unless there was merit for their entrance. My great-grandfather was listed as a laborer. In 1886, he was deeded 160 acres of land and was to raise 1,000 bushels of wheat. The wheat of the Germans from Russia was emmer. In 1901, my great-grandfather moved to a farm around Animas, North Dakota. In 1911, there was 190,000 acres of emmer grown in 3 principal areas. They were in the South Dakota area, where my great-uncles moved, and in the 1885 Jewel area, and also in the Animals area. This is a brief history of the ancient emmer and emmer in North Dakota. And then I would like to go into the usages of the emmer. From the pioneer aspect of it, I have a sample of they used to make mud bricks, and they would use the, in this here you can see the joint. You can't see it here, but on the plant here of emmer straw that they used to make the mud bricks with their house. They also made straw hats with it. And it's also used for thatching on roofs because of its durability, and also there's different properties as to resistance to molds and stuff like that within the property of this grain. They would make flatbreads usually from it because it does not make a good bread. There's Dr. Shetty will go into the different things on why that is. But one of the famous things was from the Germans from Russia was their Kuchen. And I don't know if that brings to memory a lot of family history, and also Nefla soup. Right now we're in an extreme drought area, and this is the emmer, this year's crop. Our area is considered to be a D4 area. The grain that's in my area is running about this tall right now and headed out. And as you can see, the extensive root system that's developed, and we're not going to have a bumper crop, but we will have a crop from this emmer crop. The extremes of emmer has been, I've grown emmer under both ends of the extremes, drought and also excessive moisture. This is a sample of grain that was laying in the swat, and we had around 5 to 6 inches of rain, and the grain was the field right next to me was standing, and it was growing and sprouting into heads. And when we combined it, the only thing that we're showing on this here is that there's a tint or a dulling of the seed coat, but other than that, there was no sprout damage. And Dr. Zykar and Shetty did an analysis of this crop, and they'll go into some of the benefits of this here. But there was no deterioration in that, and actually there it says an enhancement of it. That concludes my talk about emmer, and I'd be willing to take any questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Lowell. A good history there. With that, we'll turn the podium over to Dr. Shetty, and we'll likely have some questions for you, Lowell, at the end. Just a reminder to everyone, make sure that you use the chat function, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you do have any questions.
Okay, thank you, Krista, and thanks for all the NCI support. Really delighted to be here and working closely with Northern Crops Institute and how to advance high-value crops from the diversity of crops that we have in the Great Plains. So unlike many other states, the diversity here is incredible. And so within that, we were really very delighted to meet up with Lowell. And here is a story of his ancestors, which he just told you. And I had insights about emmer because it's still grown in some parts of North India as a very special grain and as something that's having health benefits. And so that excited me about his grandparents, our great-grandfather's story and how it came to North Dakota and how it helped the early settlers with their food security. And so then we thought, what is this special grain that could have extra benefits, especially without removing the hull? So as we looked at this and we rationalized with some of the challenges we are facing with food security, which I will highlight. So my talk will be about 19 slides, and I'll spend about 5 slides providing the rationale why health-targeted food systems and food systems that are relevant for climate resilience are important. So if you look at the world today, we are a population of about 7.4 billion, and we still have 1 billion of us facing hunger challenges, means not having enough macronutrients, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and minerals. So this is still a problem in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia. And this pandemic has worsened that challenge. But then we have a newer challenge, and this pandemic has, this pandemic we have seen has exposed this even further. There are 2 billion of us, from the 7.4 billion, who are facing high refined density of macronutrients, meaning too much carbohydrates, which when in a sedentary lifestyle gets converted into fat. And the consequence of that, this excess calorie burden, is we have high growth of comorbidities globally. So this growth of comorbidities has actually exposed how they're more susceptible to chronic as well as infectious diseases. And you must have heard in the news that those with comorbidities are more susceptible to the COVID infection. And so the chronic disease imbalance is direct, and its burden is directly linked to the nutritional imbalance. And so the world is facing two major types of food security imbalances. One is still the undernutrition, not getting enough macronutrients and micronutrients. But then there's a bigger and more rapidly growing challenge, which is too much of these refined, high-density calorie burden, which when we see a pandemic like infectious disease like COVID, it gets even worse. So that's where we are. And so essentially, if you look at the global public health challenges, the non-communicable chronic disease, which can be coupled into the can worsen the infectious disease, they are the major public health challenges we faced, and they are directly linked with the food security and insecurity challenge, where we need to build better nutritional security. And that's what the emmer offers us. It helps us not only to build food security with more resilience and more climate resilience, but also it helps us to build nutritional security, which is what I will articulate today. Okay, so this has to be addressed with climate change challenges. And if you look at the world, a lot of these climate change burdens are going to be still in the equator. And as you can see, the global economic system has dramatically moved to Asia, but yet the food security challenges in Asia are going to get even more acute. And we are going to have this imbalance of undernutrition, especially in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, but also this new emerging middle class that's going to demand a lot of food. And most of this food is a high calorie burden food that is causing all the challenges. So if you look at the world and you look at how the pandemic has exposed many of these insecurities of balanced nutrition, and you just follow where the pandemic is high, especially in the Americas, South Asia, parts of Europe, you can see where that's where as high as 2,000 per million versus parts of where the food diversity was wider, the numbers were much lower. Some of this data is still emerging, but the point I'm trying to make is balanced nutrition is critical to not only to manage non-communicable chronic disease, but they also feed into how infectious disease comes to us. How much susceptibility we have to infectious diseases is linked to non-communicable chronic disease. So this non-communicable chronic disease is a global burden, and particularly type 2 diabetes. And so this is where I will highlight the value of MR. So as we go forward, it's clear that we cannot just grow food in an imbalanced way. We need to build resilience for health as well as for climate resilience. So the ecosystem has to be in balance. And as we address these community and agriculture food systems problem, we need to address public health issue challenge right up in the crop production stage. We cannot wait for the disease to emerge, but right all the way from soil health to human health. So if you look at our big disease problems today, 87% of our public health problems are preventable chronic disease. But we wait for it after the disease. And most of our solutions are drug treatments, which do not work at late stage of the disease as effectively. So we need to address it right up front, all the way at the level of the ecosystem, at the level of agriculture and food system. So only then can we handle the public health crisis that we have now been actually exposed during this COVID crisis. That's the way we need to address it. So with that in mind, we need a lot of we need to tap into our crop diversity. We just cannot grow few crops with high calories. We need to diversify. We need to diversify within wheat. We need to diversify within all the other crops. Why? Because they are nutrients for disease protection that are not there, that they're there beyond the macronutrients. We need beyond proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, minerals, and vitamins. We need a lot of compounds that manage the other fine-tuning of our metabolism. And many of those compounds, we have stripped them out in our modern breeding system, but they're there in the crop diversity. So we need to build this crop diversity back for public health, as well as diversity is very good for climate resilience. When you have more diversity, you have more resilience. So this resilience is going to be the key element as we go forward with climate change, but also the exposure of the public health challenges that we have faced, this chronic diseases, non-communicable chronic diseases. So food diversity is the solution, and this needs to be rationalized with sound science as to what are these compounds that gives us health beyond the macronutrients and micronutrients. And for that, we need to go back into how plants adapted and what is the mechanism of this plant photosynthetic-based system that makes a wider array of compounds that has potential protective elements within the plant itself that then can be brought into our human diet. Because we got our macronutrients and micronutrients from the diet, whether we eat plants or whether we eat animals that eat those plants. So beyond those macronutrients and micronutrients, we also have many compounds that can regulate our body metabolism. At a gross level, we focus on the carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen-based food system that we consume. But the real breakdown in our disease comes from how we breathe. It's the oxygen that is coupled to the food that's delivered through the blood. The oxygen also goes through the blood, right? So when that is coupled and goes to every cell of the body, it's the oxygen that works with the nutrients, with the carbohydrate, which is then broken down through oxidative phosphorylation. That's where the ATP or the energy is generated from the food we eat. So it is the breakdown of the coupling of the oxygen that's needed to get the energy out is where all the disease breakdown emerges. And in the broad terms, it's an oxidative malfunction. But plants have elegantly developed many tools to counter this. And that's, depending on the plant species, has been sort of regulated in many coupled ways towards protection. So we need to tap into those plant mechanisms that have provided the plant resilience, including the emmer that came with great-grandfather of Laurel, and tap into that and see how that can regulate the body metabolism into a balance, especially when we eat excess carbohydrate. Plants have defense mechanism to meter that carbohydrates for their own growth when they need it, when they stress, or when there is a plant defense mechanism. So within the plant metabolism, there are a lot of inhibitors that control this metering out of the carbohydrates. So many of those tools are there in the grains, in the legumes, in fruits and vegetables. So the more we tap into those regulatory compounds and bring it back into our diet, that's effective. So that's why we say eat more fruits and vegetables, eat more whole grains, because when we eat whole grains, many of those protective elements that are there to regulate plant metabolism is also retained and comes back into our body metabolism. Okay. So that's where this food diversity has to be streamed back in. And so we have now targeted that particularly to the major chronic disease humanity is facing, which is carbohydrate imbalance, leading first towards type 2 diabetes. And that type 2 diabetes moves into cardiovascular disease and later to other chronic disease, from cancer to autoimmune diseases to cognitive breakdown at later stages. But the primary breakdown is at the carbohydrate metabolism level, because we are overloading ourselves with carbohydrates, whether it's refined starch or refined sugar, or look at the number of refined products that are there, from sodas to flours, and you name the, go to the aisle by aisle, you'll see a lot of carbohydrates and sugars, right? So we need to fine tune that. And the only way to fine tune that is go back to nature and look at how these natural mechanisms and our ancestors were very intuitive, right? In their different ecologies, like Laurel said, in the biblical lands or in the other areas. Every crop diversity zone where crops were domesticated, you had diversity of these different selections that we bought out, but yet we retain some of these defense mechanisms and that we can use to cross back for resistance. So many of those resistant mechanisms have to fight against their free radical energy generating mechanisms. So that coupling provides us a tool to get all these bioactive compounds that can regulate our body metabolism beyond the macronutrients and micronutrients. So that is really the rationale. So as we go forward, what we are trying to do is we are trying to see how the major chronic disease we are facing, the digestion of our soluble carbohydrates, how they can be regulated, both when we consume starch or when we just consume sugar and it goes into a sugar upload. How can that be slowed down so that you can give insulin more time to deal with it and not overload it, not wear our system out very early by overloading ourselves, right? So that can be achieved by having more whole food system. And now what are those compounds is what we are studying. So we will show that if these ancient grains have a lot of it because they were bred for different ecologies. They were not necessarily bred for the modern calorie high productive system that we have developed, which is important. We still need to feed the world and have the macronutrients and micronutrients, but we need also the protective mechanisms associated with that. So if you look at the ancient emmer wheat, Triticum dicocon, and it's known as farro, as Lowell just said, it's highly drought resistant, right? And resilience is not just flood resistance or high water resistance. And so this has a lot of potential. And Lowell gave its history. It came in 1885 here from the Ukraine-Russian area where the Catherine's Germans had settled. And so a lot of them, when old Prussia didn't take them, they came to North Dakota, right? And so a lot of them settled here, and that's where the story of this amazing grain is. And so we're really delighted to see what are these health benefits in this emmer. So we have published one paper, and we are ready to publish the second paper. Our basic strategy was, so in the modern food system, how can this emmer wheat can be integrated both in a microbiome-rich fermentation strategy, where whether it's flatbread or other breads, you can incorporate fermentation, and through incorporation of fermentation, a lot of these disease-protective elements can be improved with the help of good beneficial bacteria that are part of the microbiome. So we can use our own microbiome and modify this wonderful wheat into useful bioactive rich products. So that was one strategy. A second is the wheat itself has a lot of benefits, which I will show you. But in addition, we can couple that emmer wheat into, like in India, they couple it with chickpea or other legumes. So we can bring in functionalities towards the different kinds of products that we can get, outcome that we can have, which can then increase all of these functionalities. So here I'll show you two of our results. One is a published result, where this basic emmer, this wonderful emmer that great-grandfather of Lowell bought, what are the health benefits? What we are finding is that this emmer itself, especially when it's not hulled, right? When everything is in there, it has a lot of protective elements. And what are those? It's not only that we have, when we do antioxidant, because it's a broad category, we do multiple assays because you can have water soluble, lipid soluble, many different kinds. But in many of these, we can see even in the two major assays we use, the emmer with hull still has high protective elements, even with hull after milling and before milling. And further, it has unique compounds that are retained, M-cumaric acid, which is a phenolic compound that can have many functions, which I won't go into, but there are a lot of protective element functions related to that cumaric acid. Okay. So there are other phenolics too, but this dominates. And then as we study this further, obviously, as you remove the hull, the protein content will go up. So this is counterintuitive, very logical. But it's not the protein that we are interested in. It is what's there with the hull. That's what's giving the health benefits, both the phenolic benefits and the good beneficial fiber that can support a microbiome. Okay, so that's what's important. So as we go deeper, what we see is before milling, you can see one of the enzymes. If we see a digestive pathway, you have alpha amylase, where the starch is broken down into glucose. And then the glucose is taken up by the enteric cell, and there's an enzyme called alpha glucosidase. So current pharmaceutical solutions target these two enzymes. But the good news is a lot of plants have those similar compounds, related compounds. So we are using the very pharmaceutical screening that pharmaceutical industry does to screen our anti-diabetic compounds. And so there are many targets for anti-diabetes from early stage to late stage. But in the early stage, these two are the first line of defense, where we slow down the glucose and give the insulin enough time to deal with it. And so many drugs, Vogelibos, there are many pharmaceutical drugs for this. But the good news is we just eat those compounds from food. So the emmer has it. When you don't, without milling, the emmer retains that alpha glucosidase inhibitor. So you can digest the starch, the glucose goes down, then the enterocytes can slow down the uptake. So when you slow down the uptake, you give insulin more time to deal with it. Okay, so you make it's just like drug, but here you get a whole food system to manage it much better. Okay, so that's exciting. So this not the common emmer has that in substantial amount. And so that's exciting. So then we have we are going to publish this. We just got the reviews. We got good reviews on this. So we're going to publish in Applied Microbiology. What we have done is we have taken this organic emmer wheat and compared it to some conventional modern wheat and fermented with beneficial lactic acid bacteria. So this is sort of an analog similar to some of our beneficial bacteria. So we have a lot of good beneficial bacteria. In fact, we have 1 kilogram per person, as high as that. And so the better we feed ourselves with good diet, overall whole food diet, better we can support that. But also what we can do is we can couple this beneficial bacteria in the fermentation process and retain many of those bioactive compounds, both for the digestive inhibitors, like in type 2 diabetes, but also many of the pathogens that come into our system. One, we can support the good bacteria, or we can inhibit some bad pathogens like Helicobacter pylori, which causes ulcer. So the goal of our work is by fermenting with beneficial bacteria, this ancient emmer wheat, can we get the bioactive sustenance or bioactive enrichment that can not only improve the digestive inhibitors associated with diabetes or chronic disease, but also manage some of the pathogens that may emerge, but also support the beneficial bacteria. And there's good reasons for that, because the lactic acid metabolism is very different from pathogen. Pathogen use oxygen for its metabolism. Well, there's a lot of lactic acid bacteria, and the beneficial bacteria do not use oxygen as an energy. So this differential response of pathogens versus the beneficial bacteria can be tapped into. Then we can target the right kind of compounds to stimulate our good bacteria and inhibit our pathogens. And the good news is MR with the hull has some of those compounds that can support the good bacteria but inhibit Helicobacter pylori. So that's what our research has shown. And the good news of this, not only is some of these phenolic bioactives that are associated with digestive inhibition and the chronic disease pathway modulated and improved, but also we can get bioactive compounds that support the beneficial bacteria that we need, but inhibit the pathogens, Helicobacter pylori, and we'll show you the result of this. Next slide, please. Okay. So you can see clearly here, but this ulcer bacteria, they say even 50% of the world population carries it. So even it tells us how it went with our migrations around the world. Normally it sort of lives with us, but under certain severe chronic disease situations, it can really cause trouble and worsen other type of infections. So managing this effectively is useful, and diet-based management is very good, because then we can balance the gut. Gut is like a second brain. Right? So this gut-brain axis, if it's managed well, then the diet provides a lot of those neurochemicals. So if you provide good dietary support with good beneficial bacteria, the gut-related benefits can be improved. And one of the gut-related benefits is to ward off the bad pathogens and enrich with good bacteria. So that's best is done by our diet. And fermentation of this MR platform, MR matrix, can increase some of those compounds. So next slide, please. Okay, so with this background, with these two very exciting papers that we got out of, after meeting Laurel, we think this has a lot of outcomes, but also leads into other ancient grains, the same model. And we need more animal-based in vivo and clinical studies to further confirm some of this in vitro screening. That's what happens in pharmaceutical. They screen in vitro in large numbers, and then from the in vitro models, they go towards more animal models and clinical relevance. And then another exciting part is many of these compounds that are relevant to many of the disease-fighting qualities, they're also relevant for resilience. Because when the plants have to deal with stress, they have to couple the oxygen metabolism to channel the carbohydrates and nutrients. And they turn on the same protective common metabolism. Nature is very clever. They don't want too many reinventions. They use common pathways to retune and work. So plant in the sessile, they have to deal with it from a stationary system. So they have their own adaptations. And many of these compounds that we see health benefits for, also very good for abiotic stress resilience. So that's another exciting part of research in our lab. We have this dual function where what's good for resilience and stress biology crosses over, not totality, but in quite a number of ways. It are the foundation for some of the bioactives that are good for health. So this dual function rationale is very good, and we can pick this up from the crop diversity. So with that, we can integrate into processing strategy. Here at NCI, we have a lot of these abilities to mix and match and redesign. And so we think there is a good platform to build a not common MR-based functional foods and functional ingredients, because through Lowell, we can build a network here because they have this history from 1885. So it's very easy to sort of translate into a sort of a grower network that can then feed into this value addition or value chain. And particularly what we like to do is target flatbreads of the world because it's very conducive for flatbread design. And so, of course, different types of flatbreads are there in different parts of the world. Particularly India, which is where I have my roots, is the fastest. It's now going to be within 2025 is the biggest population on the planet. And the North India is, now it's pan-India, but generally North India is breading, chapati eating country. So there's a lot of opportunity for high value added wheat flour that can, because it's also one of the fastest growing diabetes country in the world. It's largely a vegetarian society, but a lot of high soluble carbohydrate. And even this pandemic has shown how it's been affected, especially urban environments where calorie burden is very high. So we need more whole food systems. And this is ideal, a value added, North Dakota emmer. Of course, wheat's also grown in India and emmer is also grown, but there's always a provision for a value added, opportunity for us here in North Dakota or from the Great Plains. Likewise, there are different parts of the world have sourdough, other functional wheatgrass. There's so many ways in which this emmer can move into the modern food design. As long as we retain the wholeness of it and how at different stages we can process retaining that wholeness and then rationalize it biochemically with good, sound, structure function related assays, which is what we are building a lot. And then ultimately, when we have an optimized system, it can go into a clinical setup. But clinical studies or animal studies are very expensive. So we need a lot of screening studies in the lab, targeting towards those clinical outcomes. So that's what we have. We are building a lot of these very rigorous biochemical assays that mimic some of those in vivo assays. So with that, this is where we think we are going. There's a lot of promise, and we are excited to sort of build a cooperative, sort of a farmer network that can tap into it and show such models where we can target a specialty crop that has a much higher value towards health and also resilience. So we want to build local. We are depending on the crop, we build local grower networks. We are trying to work with food barley now as well. We have a PhD student who's published quite a few papers on those and some in the pipeline. And so we want to build this, and we also have through our wide international network, we have an annual Food for Health conference, which we are planning to have one here and the alternative year in Bali, Indonesia, so that we are more closer to the market. Because 60% of the world demand or population will be in Asia. So it's better to have NCI go there than have 1 year here where we produce all of this and 1 year in the markets. So this way we build our research innovation linked to sort of dissemination of our knowledge, but also engagement of the global community. So for example, at the annual Food for Health workshop, we could have government agencies or workshops for the marketing plan, right? So there could be a separate day for NCI to sort of work with their own teams. And so we are thinking in different ways how all of this could be a comprehensive platform, all the way from our growers network here in North Dakota, but also in the wider Great Plains. Because with climate change initially, Great Plains is going to benefit, even though we're going to have variations and fluctuations of the climate change. But overall, the warming has I'm not saying everything we should be waiting for climate change, but I'm saying there are parts of the world that are going to benefit from it, these northern latitudes. And so we have to deal with it, right? So as we try to moderate the effects, we have to deal with it. So within that context, I think there are some opportunities here in the Great Plains of how resilience in food systems can be an opportunity for not only helping the local economy, but helping the larger world. And emmer is a good example, a whole grain emmer that can feed into various layers of flatbread around the world is a good opportunity. And it could, even if it's a small opportunity for 50 farmers, that's still good. Right? So that's in a nutshell. And thank you for the opportunity. And we'll pick up on this, and if there's a question and answer time, we'll be happy to answer.
We've got a number of questions for you, Dr. Shetty.
Beg your pardon?
I said we do have a number of questions for you.
There are questions here.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry.
No worries. So hopefully you can hear me.
Hi, Dr. Shetty. When you measured enzyme innovation by Emma with Hal, did you take the?
Hundreds, yeah.
Yes.
With Barlow and.
Right. Yes. We have two comparisons, Barlow and Kato.
Yeah. We had a Barlow as a hub.
Yeah, in everything we have comparisons with the current. Then, before milling was after milling, are the benefits lost immediately or after the flour has been sitting? Yeah, it's immediately. It's immediately. We don't know about aging, but we measure it immediately. But there could be an aging angle too, but we lose it right away. So it's with hull or without hull.
And also.
Yeah.
And before milling and after milling.
Before milling and after milling too. Is emmer grain considered as heritage grain? Yeah, Lowell? Lowell says yes. More questions, please? Oh.
What is the price?
What is the price of, Lowell can answer that. Before that, what is the total volume of emmer wheat in North Dakota? Lowell?
I'm the only one that's growing it. Right?
Lowell is the only one who's growing it. So we have to build up capacity. If there's demand, I think it's easy, right?
That's right.
And so next year, the important question, what is the price of emmer whole wheat flour and white flour?
There is no building done.
There's no, so it has to be built. Kim Card has emmer is hulled wheat as opposed to wheats. Your chart points how important the contents of the hull to nutrition. Without the hull is more likely. To capture the total nutritional benefit, Emma, would you say stone mill? Oh, very good. Stone milling, other system that yields whole grain would be preferred. Well, that's a good, very good question. We don't have comparison, but I think there are some benefit. I mean, obvious counterintuitive. It could, stone milling could retain many of those compounds. So, from a logical point of view, we have to still test it, but I would say, yeah, stone milling has and roller milling would have benefits, retaining the health benefits. Emmer is good for you. How do we overcome yield drag? Oh, he can give us, Lowell can answer that.
Yeah, the yield drag though is not that drastic. 1900, NDSU did a yield on emmer. It was 63 bushels an acre in the year 1900. Emmer takes 1/2 the fertilizer. As you can see, it's drought tolerant, and the only problem that we've had, if you have too much fertility, it'll grow too tall and lodge. But according to Steve Swinger, NDSU, there is no yields is comparable to exceeds modern day wheat.
Yeah, another, Lowell and me, we have been targeting some targeted consumers first. We are looking at a consumer making these wheat flour for chapatis. So if he can get sort of a targeted production towards a targeted customer, then we build up the base. And so We have a medical college in South Bangalore, South India, where this person who can source and align with us, so we can then build. So initially buy from Lowell, validate the concepts, and then scale up a sort of a farmers cooperative. So, as the validation emerges, Lowell builds the farmers network. Yes. Oh, emmer is being used in making beer. Do the nutrients we don't know that, Bruce, yet. We don't know that because we have not tested that in the beer making process, and it could be. That'll be very interesting to study.
There's a question came in. What is the average protein of emmer?
Oh. Fine. Look at the paper.
It's actually
But
6 to 8,
6 to 8.
milligram per gram dry weight.
Yeah. So that's 6 to 8 milligram per gram dry weight.
Dry.
Which is at the a typical cereal end.
So how would it compare to a modern barley or modern wheat when you start looking at protein content?
That's similar because if you see legumes, it's like on the 15 milli end. This is more like less than 10 or less than 7.
It's the same comparison with barley and katoa. It's the
It's
same
similar
weight.
to barley and katoa,
Also,
which is a standard barley. Standard wheat.
Yeah.
Very good. So it's very similar to hard red spring wheat.
Right.
Any other questions?
But always, you have our email. Please feel free to communicate. We'll be happy to answer. And then we can make a PDF copy of the slides if they want. And that'll be easy to send instead of a large file. And also the paper, our first published paper. And when we have the second published paper, we can send that as well.
Very good. Well, our time is about up. Lowell, thank you as always for the interesting presentation and for the work that you do promoting health and promoting emmer for North Dakota and the world. Dr. Shetty, it's been a pleasure as always. We look forward to having you back next month to talk about barley. So I know a topic that we've discussed and you've helped us with in courses in the past. So looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.